welcome to the AfterWord.
From the loft.
I thought I was going to get away with it. I should have paused.
You shouldn't have paused, but the pause was the thing that told me I should do it, because I'm like, Vince and Betty are both gone, and in their spirit, I have to carry on.
So today was my chance.
It was, and you screwed it up.
I messed it up. This is a podcast that we put on to try to explore more of the text that was just preached, and we want to see God's glory in it. I am joined today by Kirsten, as well as John File, one of our elders who preached the text yesterday. Thanks for doing that, John.
I was happy to.
Yeah. It was a lot of text, too, so I know that was a lot of work, so thank you for doing that. I want to ask an intro question before we get at it, and my intro question is this. John, you mentioned yesterday that you were a missionary in Japan for a while. What is a favorite place that you have visited? For both Kirsten and John, I'll answer it as well. A favorite place that you've visited?
Yeah, well, I am going to answer with a place in Japan, actually a place in Tokyo where we lived for a long time. And I will also choose a place that I got to bring Betty to on the vision trip that we were just in Japan a few weeks ago. A place called Odaiba. It's in the Tokyo waterfront area. And we didn't get to do that with Betty, but one of the things I love doing is taking, they call it a suijo bus, basically a water bus or like a water taxi across the bay from where we lived in Toyosu. You can take it all the way across the bay under Rainbow Bridge to this island called Odaiba. And just such a beautiful view, 360 of the waterfront, of all the buildings, of all the, you just see so many sections of Tokyo along the way. And then when you get to Odaiba, one of the really cool things that I also got to take Vince to is this huge 3-story replica Gundam robot.
Wait a minute. A 3-story robot?
Yes.
It's like 30, 40 feet high.
Exactly, yes.
What does it do?
It looks cool.
Is it functional, or does it just look like a robot?
It looks like a robot. It's from a Japanese animation.
Oh, okay.
That's from way back. It's very famous. Anyway, it
looks a little bit like Bumblebee, from
Transformers. Yeah. So I have a picture with Vince in front of this. I also have a picture with Betty, and I have a picture with Calvin. We all have pictures in front of Gundam in Odaiba. So that's a fun place.
His name is
Gundam.
Gundam. Okay. I was thinking you were saying, do you remember have you guys seen Night in the Museum?
Yes.
And he's like, gum, dum, dum. That's what I thought you were saying.
The Easter Island talking head.
Different.
That's different. Kirsten, what about you?
I would probably say several years ago, my sister was living in Switzerland, and for Christmas, she gave me her frequent flyer miles, and I got to fly over and see her. And probably the Swiss Alps. They were just unbelievable. Like everything that you would imagine, but more. So, yeah, they were incredible.
Wow, that sounds incredible. A few years ago, we had the opportunity to travel with some friends to Puerto Rico, which was gorgeous. We were able to camp right on a beach on a little island off of Puerto Rico called Flamenco Beach. And so we were literally probably 50 yards from the water and just set up a tent, and we stayed there for a few days. It was so pretty. The water's so pretty. That was a good time. All right, well.
That was a really smooth transition. I didn't feel awkward at all.
Hey, you can always get away with, well?
Yeah. Hey, John, give us a recap from chapter 9, please.
Yes. I mentioned on Sunday that chapter 9 comes between chapter 8 and chapter 10.
Oddly enough.
Yeah, isn't that amazing?
That's weird.
And that these chapters are carrying a cohesive, larger argument or discussion. And Paul is challenging the church and is doing so by his own example, which is compelling, that he's not just telling people what to do. He's modeling a Christ-like lifestyle, which is a lifestyle of being willing to voluntarily surrender your rights, your freedoms. I talked about how, or in the text we see the freedom we have in Christ it's such a gift. We are not burdened or shackled by the law and by somehow earning, right, our salvation. So there's great freedom, and yet that freedom is something that we can lay down for the sake of others. And in chapter 8, we see Paul challenging the church to lay down their rights for the sake of unity within the church. Chapter 9, we see Paul talking about laying down our rights and being willing to consider the context and the needs and the situation of and the lifestyle choices even of those around us as we seek to build bridges for the gospel message. So the simple summary of the sermon was giving up our rights to build gospel bridges.
So we are given all this freedom from Christ, bought for us by his blood. Inherent in that, I suppose we could argue we do have certain rights as a child of God in relationship to God. And what Paul now is saying is, we have that freedom and it's beautiful, but there are certain situations and times where we should curb those, in a sense. And we're seeing some examples here. I think how I'd like this conversation to go, I want to ask a couple of questions that maybe are clarifying questions, a couple of questions about the text that help us understand it, maybe a couple pieces about it. And then after that, I want to spend a lot of time talking about application. How might this be applying today? So here is my first question, John. This is directed right at you by a listener. And the question was this. You made the point, which is really clear, that Paul did not ask for financial support from the church in Corinth, but rather we see Paul's example where in other places where he's receiving aid from a different location. The question is this: was that specific to Corinth? And if so, why specifically Corinth did Paul not look for financial aid?
No, that's a great question. And I think we see the principle of not being a burden to the local context so that there's no obstacle to the gospel. We see clearly that was the case in Corinth. And actually, I need to give credit to Kirsten, who helped look this up, that
It was just Google. I wasn't that smart.
Well, you still looked it up. Well, there was another city, which was Philippi. Is that right?
that's actually really interesting if Paul did not receive support while in Philippi, because later we see in Paul's correspondence that the church in Philippi did support him when he was in Thessalonica. We see this in Philippians chapter 4, verse 16. And he's so a letter to the Philippian church saying, even in Thessalonica, you sent me help for my needs once and again. So I think there's a sense of not wanting to be a burden or presenting some obstacle to the people he's directly ministering to, while at the same time receiving the generous support from believers who share that same burden for gospel ministry.
I find myself wondering, too, if a piece of this was Paul actually kind of pushing against just the Jewish traditions, in that, like in the Old Testament dispensation, the priests were actually told they were to be given support in order when they were full-time servants in the temple. And so I wonder if a piece of it is just Paul saying, this is not the old order, this is the new order. And in the old order, the priests were commanded by God to be supported by the temple, but we're in a new dispensation now. This is not the temple and God, but this is Christ and his church.
Yeah, this is something different. John, in verse 3, this might relate, I'm not sure. I know in this first section you gave us a good overview and you wanted to really focus on the middle. In verse 3, Paul says, this is my defense to those who would examine me, and then he talks about the rights that he has. Is that part of it? It seemed like implied in that there's some sort of accusation that he's having to defend himself by saying, I actually have all these rights, but I'm freely giving them up. Did you see anything about that in your study?
Yes, that's a great question, Eric. And there are some different perspectives on this. Leading up and throughout 1 Corinthians, there are explicit questions that the church in Corinth is asking, and then Paul responds to it. He'll say things like, now concerning food offered to idols, or now concerning. it doesn't appear that he is answering a question here. It seems like in this section, verses 1 through 9, he's creating, he's using these rhetorical questions, these negatively phrased rhetorical questions, in a sense, kind of drawing them in. These are things we understand, don't we? These are shared understandings. So even that line, "This is my defense," it doesn't appear that he is directly answering critics as much as he is just clarifying and kind of building a case, building a strong case to then challenge, point out that he is then choosing to let go of that right.
Okay. Another question I had about this text I wanted to ask you. Down in verses, let me pull up here real quick. Starting in verse 20, where he says, "To the Jews I became as a Jew, to those under the law I became as those under the law, to those outside the law I became to those outside the law." And then in verse 22, he says, "To the weak I became weak." And it sounds like in your study, he's probably talking about fellow Christians here. And so part of this sounds like he's talking about evangelism to those who aren't believers yet. But then there in verse 22, it sounds like he's actually talking about a relationship to people in the church as well. So could you just clarify, is in this context, is he primarily talking about giving up our rights for the sake of bringing others to Christ in the first place? Or is it to restore a believer? I think that was your word yesterday, to win back, to restore a believer. Or is it actually a mix?
So you're asking specifically about 22 with the word weak?
Yeah, that's what made me think of it.
Yeah, and again, trying to look at resources and perspectives of other godly interpreters of Scripture, the sense here is that there's more than one thing going on. And so clearly, Paul is talking about winning unbelievers to Christ. We see not only the word win, but ultimately that he might save some is the term that you get near the end of that section. But also we have the context of just the previous chapter 8, and in other places where we see Paul talking about the weak and engaging the weak. And in chapter 8, he's addressing the church and the way that the quote, puffed up, arrogant believers were treating, the quote unquote weak believers that seem to be relating more to their dynamic and their attitude than to necessarily believers versus non-believers. So I think if you sort of, just because the context in Scripture, I think that we can see that using that word weak is, like you were saying, more than likely relating to believers that are weak in knowledge, perhaps weaker in their conscience, or even weak socially or financially, in a way that would be looked down on. And then Paul is saying, I am going to identify with them. Each of these cases, though, I think what unites the three cases is Paul is identifying with, building a bridge to people in different social, even moral or religious contexts. Yeah,
all for the sake of the gospel.
All for the sake of the gospel, in that bigger sense that the gospel is what is needed for the unbeliever to come to know God. The gospel is what is needed for the believer to live day by day in fellowship with God.
I'm just thinking how this also ties into everything that we've learned thus far in 1 Corinthians, and the fact that Paul is writing a letter to the church for the unity of the church, and just thinking even within the church, if there are weaker believers, it can be probably the temptation for a stronger believer to maybe disdain or get frustrated with the weaker believer. And even in that, Paul is kind of destroying that disdain or the frustration and just saying, well, no, be gracious and kind of lower yourself to that point for the sake of unity in the church.
Mm-hmm.
Would you rather bring correction in such a way that maybe shames someone or causes them to withdraw, or do you want to lower yourself and try to meet them where they are and then walk with them towards holiness?
That's so good.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of getting over yourself kind of stuff. To Paul's point, he's not accepting any financial aid, which means he needed to do some sort of fundraising in order to be there in the first place. I don't know about you guys, but if I look at jobs and fundraising as a piece of it, I don't think so. I don't want it that bad.
Hard pass.
Yeah.
Certainly, we saw that he did receive support. He also was a tent maker.
Yeah.
And so Priscilla and Aquila were some that he worked with in Corinth there as another way to provide for his needs.
Yeah, thank you, both of you, for interacting on that. I want to move a little bit to application because I think this is where I need a lot of help thinking about this. I have had some trouble thinking of how the principles in chapter 9 apply to my life currently. Not that they don't or not that they shouldn't. And actually, maybe this might be an issue with me that I'm not living in such a way where these questions are more in my face. So I want to ask some application questions. Let me just keep it pretty broad to start. What are some ways that come to mind that this might apply to us in our culture, in Fort Collins today, a giving up of our rights for the sake of the gospel?
As we were talking before we started recording, I said it's really hard to think about rights that we give up. And I think in general, as Americans, we have so many rights and so many freedoms. And so there's often not a lot we have to sacrifice. And so, that's to maybe my shame that there's not a lot that I'm giving up for the sake of the gospel. I can think of a lot of examples that I've chosen to maybe more become all things to all people. So giving up preferences or things along those lines. But rights, I don't know that I could come up with a lot of examples of that. It's probably more things along the lines of the right to being understood, and willingness to sacrifice that and be misunderstood, maybe be misrepresented as far as what's the broader view of what a Christian is, as far as culturally in America, things along those lines. But as far as freedoms, I don't know as an American that we do give up a whole lot.
You could think about it in the sense of, and I'm not trying to give any legal advice here, so this is a caveat. I'm just saying as a broad example of if there was an accident or some sort of legal dispute, you have the right to sue or you have the right to bring about resolution through a legal system. Vince addressed this to some degree in a recent sermon, that we do have our culture and our way of resolving conflicts often is based on legal suits and different things. But it is one example where you could say, I could bring up charges or have a legal argument against this situation. I'm going to choose to not press charges or choose to not, sue someone in this situation because I see that we're in a relationship and there's more to it than just the bottom line.
That does make me think of an example. I know somebody who was at a gas station and I think it was icy, and another car had come in and slid and it hit their car. Big old dent on the side, took off the side view mirror, but it was on private property, and there was still an exchange of insurance and all of that. So all of that seemed good, but then it wasn't until later that it turned out that the person who had hit them actually did not have the insurance that their form said because they never paid their premium. And so calling the insurance company didn't help because they weren't covered anymore. And so this person was in conversation with the people who hit them for, I don't know, it was a while, at least a matter of weeks, saying, hey, you don't have insurance, how are we going to take care of this? And the other person would be like, yeah, I'll take care of it, but kept on kicking the can down the road. This person even found where they lived and where the people lived that hit them. And so went with a friend to try to talk in person, knocked on the door, talked real briefly, but it's still just kicking the can down the road. And so eventually, it looked like they weren't going to get any settlement at all. They were challenged by another friend saying, hey, this actually might be an opportunity to show the gospel to this person, that they hit you, they owe you, in that way. And for you to simply say, and I forgive you, I'm not going to seek any sort of compensation for it, could speak volumes to what Jesus did for us. And so that's what they did. Who knows how that landed? Who knows what happened from that? But that is an example of something I think that you're getting at a little bit, John.
Yeah, I think thank you for sharing that. You don't know the outcome. You don't know the result of giving up your rights. You hope that you'll have a great story of how this was used for their salvation. But in the moment, all you can choose to do is how God's Spirit leads you. And in that case, to be a tangible model of God's grace.
Yeah.
I do wonder in those situations, though, like, are we called at that point for the sake of the gospel to actually say, I'm doing this because I'm a Christian and because God has been gracious to me, and so I would like to extend that grace to you? Because you're right, we don't know how God will use that or how that will end up. But is the intent there more so like, let me extend this grace to you and let me frame it for you because I am a believer. This is what I'm doing. I don't know. I mean, you don't want to leverage the gospel necessarily in those situations. And at the same time, you do want people to know, like, I'm doing this because I love Jesus, and I think this is the right thing to do to serve you in this situation.
Yeah, without it sounding like some big guilt trip or something, but still communicating tactfully the motivation.
For sure. I mean, I thought of another small example. I have a neighbor that's pretty particular about things around his house, and he's had a few situations with my boys that he just always assumes the worst. He assumes they're up to no good. He assumes that they're doing things intentionally, and he'll reach out and text me and just say, hey, tell your boys not to do this. And you know, and I try to be very gracious and kind with him, but also, like, I want to maintain an open door, and I don't want to be defensive. And so, you know, I'm quick to apologize and try to own what we can own. But I think we've also landed in, we're just going to be misunderstood, that my boys were not intending harm in whatever situation. Like, one of my boys parked, there was supposed to be hail, and he has a pine tree that kind of overhangs the sidewalk. So I asked my son to go pull his car underneath the pine tree. And my son was going to be leaving a couple hours later, and so he left it. And the neighbor, texted and was upset because my son was being inconsiderate of people wanting to use the sidewalk and get his car off in front of his yard. He kind of blew it up, and I was just like, I'm sorry. I instructed him to move it there, but we'll get it moved. And so a willingness to be misunderstood, a willingness to probably wrongly accused in situations, and yet owning it for the sake of keeping that door open so that we can have hopefully further conversations down the road.
Yeah, that's helpful. That idea of being misunderstood. And I know just in my own personality, and I want my words to be clear. I want people to understand what I'm saying. And when people misunderstand me, it feels like an offense. It feels, it feels heavy and frustrating. And to let go of that, it's not a legal right, but it feels like it's my right to be understood. And at least for me, that resonated, that story did, of can we let go of something because we realize it's only going to create an obstacle, and how do we, build a bridge? A bridge just creates the opportunity for ongoing interaction, relationship.
One example that did come to my mind, I don't know if this is a good one or not, but is my self-perceived right to my own time. Especially like when you're tired, or it's the evenings or the weekends or whatever it is, there's things that I'd probably much rather do than, I don't know, talk to a neighbor or spend time with other people. You've seen my introversion come out. But I wonder if I am much more slow to give up my time for the sake of building relationships with people for the sake of the gospel than I should be. I could see that one hitting for sure. And then the other convicting part is I remember having this conversation probably a year ago on the podcast about the same thing. Like, yeah, time is probably something I hold on to too tightly. And I am sure I still do.
So to honor the empty chair, Betty is not with us right now. She shared with me an example of when she was overseas in the Middle East a few summers ago on a mission trip, and she was struck with how the cultural norms of how people socialized, particularly how late into the evening that culture people would tend to hang out, and that you would maybe come over for dinner, but then after dinner there would be some kind of refreshment, and then there would be some sort of snack, and then there would be some sort of drinks or desserts, or there was just like this ongoing process and extended relational engagement. But it meant not leaving their house till 11 or even later. And she was very aware. My understanding of the way she explained it to me was she was happy to be there, but she's thinking, I have things to do tomorrow. I need to get up early. I need to do, whether it's a personal rhythm of, say, quiet time or other things, or appointments or something, and to let go of preferences for the sake and of her schedule and give that up for the sake of building a relationship in that moment.
I was reading this morning in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers. I was reading in Numbers. And it was interesting. It talked about how the people would set up camp, and then they would just have to wait on the Lord to lift the cloud. And and then that's when they knew to move. And it said it was sometimes 2 days, a few more days, a few weeks or more. And I was struck with the fact that like their time schedule was completely dependent on what the Lord instructed them to do, and they had no idea when he was going to lift the cloud.
That'd be hard for
and
me.
They had I think that's probably why it stuck out to me. They also had no idea how long they were going to be there.
Yeah.
So it may have been in 2 days, it may have been 2 weeks, it may have been 2 months. It just all depended on the Lord. But I think I felt the same sense of conviction on Sunday that I hold my time really closely. And like I have my evening rhythms, and like after dinner, like Vince and the boys clean up, and then it's kind of time to start winding down. And I don't want to go out in the cul-de-sac and hang out with the neighbors, and I don't want to go engage with people more. And so I think that passage in particular just kind of gave me pause to consider, like, I don't think I am as surrendered with time as the Israelites had to be in that situation. And I think that's what God is asking of us.
One thing, if I could pivot for us.
Sure.
We were talking about a little bit, we're using this word rights, and Paul uses this word, his rights, particularly his rights as an apostle. But he uses the word rights up to a point, and then he kind of shifts his terminology. The more that he's talking about reaching outside of the church, he doesn't use the word rights as much as he uses the words to become like, that sort of become all things to all people. Of course, with the caveat that we talked about of not sinning, not living in a way contrary to God's design, God's word. But I think that in that mentality of building a bridge for the gospel message, kind of building trust, building relational connection, that gospel message can travel across, that sometimes it is those little things, accommodating someone's diet, accommodating someone's preferences, everything from certainly food to even sports affiliation or hobbies or even political views or other or their religious beliefs, to find what are ways that I can not compromise my beliefs, but where can I find within the mixture of all the different facets that make a person, what are some of the things, even if I disagree with 80% of how they present themselves, what are the 20%? What's the 20% that I could seek to engage with? And I think that's part of what Paul is modeling to us here. To become like the Jews wasn't that he fully deconverted to Judaism. No, but he found ways to find common ground.
Yeah, before That's helpful. Before we started recording, you gave some examples of how you've tried to do that in the past. Do you mind giving any examples?
Sure. Like on the Fort Collins side, yeah. I mean, one example, we have a neighbor, and for their privacy, I won't give their specific country of origin, but a country and a religious background very different from Christianity. And we've gotten to know them, enjoyed getting to know them, and we invited them over for Thanksgiving a few years ago, and they were vegetarian. And so Sarah did the hard work of making a stuffed squash as like a showpiece dish that you could slice, and it kind of looked more impressive than. Anyway, we don't have a lot of vegetarian dishes in our repertoire, but Sarah researched and came up with something. It seemed like a small way to celebrate with them and for them to sort of come into some of our traditions, but at the same time, what's a way that they could feel honored and invited? And that's one small example.
Yeah.
And a non-Christian family, actually, not just without religious belief, but with very different religious beliefs. And so our desire was, hey, how can we begin to strengthen our relationship with them?
Other examples come to mind like that, where you conform a little bit to somebody else without crossing lines of sinning in order to build a relationship with them for the gospel?
We had neighbors at our old house that worked for a few breweries in town, and they wanted to just sit around the fire pit and have a beer. And I hate beer. Like I tried so hard to like beer, and I just hate beer. So I don't drink very often, but this was just something that was such a piece of their culture and what they wanted. And so I found a drink that I could drink and not like feel just be like ugh, and so it was strange to be like going on a mission to find something that I could sit around a fire and drink with neighbors, just sip on, nothing out of control, but it for them it was a piece of their cultural comfort that they wanted. And even whenever you'd have water or something, no, let me get you something, I'm like, no, but it almost created this weirdness, like they didn't have a category for something different. And so that was a time that I was like, well, I'm going to find something I like to drink and, and sip on it while I sit and talk with them for the sake of being able to sit around the fire and entering into their world and things that feel important to them.
That's a great example.
A few examples of, I think that we could all relate to in different ways, but musical artists or cultural trends or fads or things like that. There was a guy that I was seeking to make a connection with, and just found out that his musical preferences were very different than mine. Kind of a whole genre that I was not well versed in. Okay, rap.
You're not well versed in that, John?
And it's Super Bowl. The halftime show was focused on this particular rap artist, and before the Super Bowl or during the Super Bowl, gearing up for the halftime, I was like, okay, I have no idea. I don't know the songs. I don't know what's going to happen. But I texted this guy and just said, hey, are you excited, for this halftime show? And we started an interchange, and I felt like, I just had a thread that I was pulling on. Like I didn't have a lot to go on, but it was a small effort to reach out to this person's world, and we had an interchange. That those are small examples of trying to find common ground, and even weakly, even humbly trying to build a bridge. But this is a person that I've been growing in a relationship with. So
yeah, I've had those moments where I'm talking with a person or a couple of people, trying to get to know them, and their interests are wildly different than mine. And I remember one time it was like cars or engines or something, which I know virtually nothing about, no interest in cars whatsoever. but I could say at least enough to kind of keep the conversation going. I felt, to your point yesterday, John, that question when you asked, have you ever felt like you're in an uncomfortable situation where you stick out? Absolutely. In conversations like that, I'm like, man, I do not know what I'm talking about, but I'm trying here a little bit to try to build some relationship. Yeah, I felt that often.
When in doubt, right? Let the other person talk, right? You
Just ask a question.
Prompt them to talk about what they love.
Yeah. What's anything, any part of the engine?
Flux capacitor.
Tell me your
Explain
favorite
that.
kind of carburetor, whatever that is.
Yeah, no kidding.
No, the fear in that is that they'll say, now what's yours? And be like, no idea.
I don't know what it does even, actually.
I like the black ones.
Yeah, the black ones.
I think it's really helpful as we're engaging with what does it look like to apply this to our life here in Fort Collins. We want to think about practical things. We're talking about, people who are gluten-free perhaps or have allergies, or we're talking about musical genres or sports interest. Those are very practical ways. I do think, and this is something that is a part of my world, and I spent a number of years, and our family has, living overseas and engaging in global cross-cultural missions. That feels like, maybe that's out there. But the reality is, even in Fort Collins, which is not terribly diverse statistically, but still, I know on my street there are multiple families from, a family with an Indonesian background, a family from India, a family with a Chinese background, and others, that we will engage with individuals or families from other countries in the world. And so I think it's valid and helpful to recognize that missionary principles of you take something fixed like the gospel. There's a term we talk about in missions of fixed theology, flexible methodology. How you engage with someone should reflect their culture, their context, their values, their personality, but the gospel message itself doesn't change, but we might communicate it differently. And I do think Paul himself is a good example of this, that as you read through the book of Acts, and even when Paul gave the example of engaging with the Jew, engaging with the Gentile one not under the law, engaging with the weak, he's also painting a picture of the different spheres that he would interact with. Even in a city, he would go to the local synagogue. He's engaging with Jews, and then in the same city, he would be engaging with the Gentiles. And so just a quick example, and something that you could spend some time flipping through, but if you look at Acts chapter 13, Paul was engaging with the Jews in a synagogue in Antioch, and he approaches sharing the gospel message by painting a huge narrative flow from the Old Testament up through Jesus. Later, the next chapter, Acts 14, he's in this city Lystra, full of superstitious pagans, a little more of a rural context, and he speaks of general revelation, God being revealed through his gracious provision of the rains and the seasons, and understanding of the world around them. That's how Paul engaged them first. And then in Acts 17, a few chapters later, we talked about Paul on Mars Hill, where he's engaging with philosophers and intellectuals, and he is quoting their poets. He is talking to them about their religious idols, and found a particular idol that he could use as an entry point to talk about an unknown God, this God that they don't know but has made them and loves them. I just think that's interesting to look at. That's Acts 13, 14, and 17, if you wanted to flip through and recognize when we share the gospel with, let's say, a neighbor whose political views may be on the other end of the spectrum, we are going to approach them in a particular way. If we're talking to a child, a young kids on the street, we're going to approach them in a different way. If we're talking to someone from another culture or context, if they're from the Middle East, or they're from Africa, if they're from Asia, there are very significant differences in even how the gospel should be communicated to them. Now, there's all kinds of research and books you can do in this, but for example, typically in sort of what we would call Western or say American or European context, you're dealing with guilt and innocence, and that's an important structure that feels kind of natural to us as we talk about the gospel, God taking away our guilt. But then in an Asian context or Middle East context, you're really talking more about shame and honor. And in other contexts that are more animistic, Africa and other locations, you're dealing with fear and power. And that when you try to explain the gospel in kind of a Western way in, say, an Eastern or African context, that is not necessarily going to make sense. So that's a whole lot of words there to say we need to do research to love people well. Let's say you have a neighbor that moves in from a very different cultural context. You might need to read a couple books. You might need to ask some friends. You might need to do some research on what actually would be meaningful to this person, what would show them love, what would begin to crack a window open for a gospel conversation.
Well, because I think at the heart of most people is they want to be known and understood. And if you're presenting a gospel that feels like you're missing them and you don't really know their heart or you don't know what they're struggling with, it can feel like there's a lack of connection there. And so I think as we build these bridges, like building bridges of how can I come to know this person and understand where they're coming from and what causes them to tick. And that is going to be the thing that allows those gospel bridges to be built, because like you said, like Paul talked about the plaque to the unknown God, and he knew that gods were important in this culture, so he was able to connect with them at that, and he was a master at that, of just understanding the culture and understanding how these people felt known in their present context in order then to be able to create gospel bridges to those things.
Yeah, what I'm struck by is, I was going to say, man, it sure seems like Paul's example then to us is that we need to be willing to be flexible to build a relationship with people with the gospel. But for Paul, it's stronger than that. It wasn't just a willingness. He was motivated because he wanted to share in the blessings of the gospel with him. So that's convicting to me too. John, thanks for your work on this passage. Appreciate it. Thanks for preaching and for your work. This coming Sunday, we are jumping into chapter 10. It's chapter 10, verses 1 through 22. Give it a read, and we will see you then. Thanks for listening.
Thank you.
Bye. Oh, if you're still listening, here's my last question. What's God like? I'm totally going to do this. I'm hopefully edit in a way that makes sense. What's God like according to chapter 9?
I don't think you can edit it now. Like, I think you have to leave that in.
I'm going to try.
I think what this shows us is, once again, like, God cares deeply that we engage with unbelievers, and he wants us to humble ourselves and become like Christ. Like, Christ is the picture of someone who gave up his rights and gave up his freedoms and gave up everything in order to come to earth to serve us and to bring us an opportunity to have a relationship with him and to know God. And so if Christ was willing to do that, giving up an entire kingdom to come to earth, then anything we give up is so small compared to what Christ did for us.
Yeah. This is, I'm trying to remember a quote from a pastor friend, and I'm going to have to mostly paraphrase it, but the story is not about us, but it's about him. It's about God. And our part is not a bill of rights, but a call to service. Those few lines have stuck with me over the years of it's not our story, it's God's story. And it's a privilege given to us that we surrender to the storyline God is writing, and that might involve some hardship for us. It might involve some loss, some difficulty, but it's for that greater story of salvation, of God's kingdom, of restoration. And that second part about, and our part is not a bill of rights. It's not demanding, this is what I should have, this is what I've earned, this is, based on my age and status and position in the church. I should not have to do that. I should only be asked to do this. That's we're clinging to a bill of rights versus saying, no, my role is an act of service. How can I serve? How can I follow Christ's example of the the suffering servant. How is that actually the way I should approach each day?
Yeah, and that's really close to mine too. I'm struck that God invites us here to get over ourselves in a sense, and that's actually good for us. Paul says he's excited about that because he wants to share in the blessings of the gospel. But not only does we have the sort of God who invites us into that, but the sort of God who did that to a greater degree, to Kirsten's point as well. And so it's a good, loving, and gracious God we have. Okay, for real this time. Thanks for listening. Bye.